Okay, so we're going to read a few pages. I'm going to read them to you. You do not have to write anything in your notebook. But after this video of reading and listening, there is a video link in Classroom to Edpuzzle where you will have about 12 questions to answer. So be careful. This reading and then also that video should help you answer each question as you go. So in the mid-19th century, a priest named Gregor Mendel tended a garden in a Central European monastery. Mendel's experiments in the peaceful garden would one day revolutionize the study of heredity. Heredity is the passing of physical characteristics from parents to offspring. Mendel wondered why different pea plants had different characteristics. Some pea plants grew tall while others were short. Some produced green seeds while others had yellow seeds. Each different form of a characteristic, such as a stem height or seed color, is called a trait. Mendel observed that the pea plant's traits were often similar to those of their parents. Sometimes, however, the plants had different traits from those of their parents. Mendel experimented with thousands of pea plants to understand the process of heredity. Today, Mendel's discoveries form the foundation of genetics, the scientific study of heredity. Okay, so we're going to refer to this figure down here as I read to you. So in figure 1, a pea plant's flower. The flower's petals surround the pistil and the stamen. The pistil produces female sex cells or eggs. The stamen produces pollen, which contains the male sex cells or sperm. A new organism begins to form when egg and sperm join in the process called fertilization. Before fertilization can happen in the pea plant, pollen must reach the pistil of the pea flower. This process is called pollination. Pea plants are usually self-pollinating. In self-pollination, pollen from a flower lands on the pistil of the same flower. Mendel developed a method by which he cross-pollinated or crossed pea plants. To cross two plants, he removed pollen from a flower on one plant. He then brushed the pollen onto a flower on a second plant. Crossing pea plants. Suppose you wanted to study the inheritance of traits in pea plants. What would you do? Mendel decided to cross plants with contrasting traits. For example, tall plants with short plants. He started his experiment with purebred plants. A purebred organism is the offspring of many generations that have the same trait. For example, purebred short pea plants always come from short parents. Okay, so as I'm reading this section here, you're going to look this area here. This is the parent generation, and then this is the first offspring, and then this is the second generation of offspring, okay? So in one experiment, Mendel crossed purebred tall plants with purebred short plants. Scientists today call these parent plants the parental generation or P generation. So that's this right here. The offspring from the cross are the first filial generation or F1 generation. The word filial comes from filia and filius, which are the Latin words for daughter and son. So in figure 2, notice that all of the offspring in F1 generation, which is here, were all tall, even though one of the parent plants was short, right here. None of the offspring, right here, were short. The shortness trait seemed to disappear. So F2, offspring. When the plants in the F1 generation, so these here, were full grown, Mendel allowed them to self-pollinate. Surprisingly, the plants in the F2, second filial, which is down here, generation, were a mix of tall and short plants. 3 tall, 1 short. The shortness trait had reappeared, even though none of the F1 parents, which is here, these are the parents of these here, were short. So Mendel counted all the tall and short plants. about 3/4 of the plants were tall, while 1/4 were short. So obviously he had much more plants than just these 4, but his fraction that he ended up with was about 3/4 tall to 1/4 short. So Mendel also crossed pea plants with other contrasting traits. Compare the two forms of each trait in figure 3. So that's all this stuff over here. In all of Mendel's crosses, only one form of the trait appeared in the first generation. However, in the second generation, the lost, see how it's in quotes, form of the trait always reappeared in about 1/4 of the plants. Okay, that's a super big deal. Mendel reached several conclusions on the basis of his experimental results. He reasoned that individual factors or sets of genetic information must control the inheritance of traits in peas. The factors that controlled each trait exist in pairs. Mom, dad. The female parent contributes one factor, 1, while the male parent contributes the other factor, 2. Finally, one factor in a pair can mask or hide the other factor. The tallness factor, for example, masks the shortness factor. Today, scientists use the word gene for the factors that control a trait. Alleles are the different forms of a gene. The gene that controls stem height in peas, for example, has one allele for tall stems and one allele for short stems. Each pea plant inherits 2 alleles from its parents. One allele from the egg and one other from the sperm. A pea plant may inherit 2 alleles for tall stem, 2 alleles for short stem, or one of each. Again, that's a big deal. An organism's traits are controlled by the alleles inherited from its parents. Some alleles are dominant, while other alleles are recessive. A dominant allele is one whose trait always shows up in the organism when the allele is present. A recessive allele, on the other hand, is hidden whenever the dominant allele is present. A trait controlled by a recessive allele will only show up if the organism does not have the dominant allele. Figure 3 shows dominant and recessive alleles. Getting confusing. I get it. Okay, it's going to get a little bit more confusing before it starts to get a little bit easier. So pay close attention. So in pea plants, the alleles for tall stems is dominant over the allele for short stems. Pea plants with one allele for tall stems and one allele for short stems will be tall. The allele for tall stems mask or cover the allele for short stems. Only pea plants that inherit 2 recessive alleles for short stems will be short. So it's kind of like less likely. That was why there was only one short plant and there were 3 tall plants in that third generation. Technically the second generation because we have parent, first generation, second generation. In Mendel's cross for stem height, the purebred tall plants in the pea generation, those are the parents, had 2 alleles for tall stems. The purebred short plants had 2 alleles for short stems. Again, these were the parents. In the first generation, plants each inherited an allele for tall stems from the tall parent and an allele for short stems from the short parent. Therefore, each of that first generation plant had one allele for tall stems and one allele for short stems. The first generation plants were called hybrids. Hybrid is that 2 different alleles for a trait. For the first generation plants all the first generation plants are tall because the dominant allele for tall stems masks the recessive allele for short stems. When Mendel crossed the first generation plants, some of the offspring in the second generation inherited 2 dominant alleles for tall stems. These plants were tall. Other second generation plants inherited one dominant allele for tall stems and one recessive allele for short stems. These plants were also tall. The rest of the second generation plants inherited two recessive alleles for short stems. These plants were short. So let's talk about the symbols here. Geneticists use letters to represent alleles. A dominant allele is represented by a capital letter. For example, the allele for tall stems is represented by T. That's a capital T. A recessive allele is represented by a lowercase version of the letter. So the allele for short stems would be represented by a lowercase t. They like to keep the letters the same so that you know that, like, hey, T stands for, like, the tallness, and then, hey, the tall ones are dominant, we make them capital. When a plant inherits two dominant alleles for tall stems, its alleles are written as TT. And of course, it's going to be tall. When a plant inherits two recessive alleles for short stems, its alleles are written as TT, and it's going to be short. When a plant inherits one allele for tall stems and one allele for short stems, its alleles are written as capital T, lower t. So it's mixed here, but what's important to know is that the tall trait, that is dominant. So even though it has that recessive allele, it's still going to present itself as a tall plant. So we're going to apply this down here to the bunny rabbits. So in rabbits, the allele for black fur is dominant over the allele for white fur. Okay, so let's think about this. Okay, so let's use the letter B for black fur. So since black fur is dominant, then that means that we would use an uppercase B. So we could have an uppercase B allele, which means dominant black fur. And we could have another uppercase allele. We could have an uppercase and a lowercase, which means the lowercase b would be a recessive trait, which it would not produce then black, but white fur. And then we could have two recessive alleles, which would then produce the white fur bunny. So these two produce the black fur bunny. Now, I know that this looks confusing because in Mendel's pea plant experiment, we saw that there was 3 out of 4 tall plants, but here it looks like we only have 3. Now, that's a little bit misleading, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. Just a little bit here. Mendel's discoveries of genes and alleles eventually changed scientists' ideas about heredity. Before Mendel, most people thought that the traits of an individual organism were simply a blend of their parents' characteristics. According to this idea, if a tall plant and a short plant were crossed, the offspring would all have medium height. However, when Mendel crossed purebred tall and purebred short pea plants, the offspring were all tall. Mendel's experiments demonstrated that parents' traits do not simply blend in the offspring. Instead, traits are determined by individual separate alleles inherited from each parent. Some of these alleles, such as the allele for short height in pea plants, are recessive. If a trait is determined by a recessive allele, the trait can seem to disappear in the offspring. Unfortunately, the importance of Mendel's discovery was not recognized during his lifetime. Then in 1900, 3 different scientists rediscovered Mendel's work. These scientists quickly recognized the importance of Mendel's ideas. Because of his work, Mendel is often called the father of genetics. Okay, now to clarify, you are going to now go watch a quick video. It's not super long. and it demonstrates what we just now read. It pauses and it asks you questions about dominant and recessive and kind of some vocabulary, but it's right there on the screen for you.